Hello there, this is Sohail Hasni, your host at Energypreneurs. Cheap solar power, batteries, and electric vehicles are changing the transport and energy sector as we know. I bring in guests to this podcast who will help you with their ideas to navigate this energy transition. Thank you for joining. Hi, Alfredo. Good morning.
Good morning, Sohail.
We had a chat many years back about energy policy, but the world has changed now. You're doing some more exciting stuff, I gather. Maybe introduce yourself first and then we get into it.
I'm Alfredo Baño. I've been working with ADB as a consultant since 2011 and as a staff since 2017. And I've been engaged in different roles. And currently I'm working for the energy sector office, developing energy projects now focused in Uzbekistan, where I'm based since last summer.
Oh, nice. So earlier you were mentioning that a lot of your recent energy has gone into one key factor of energy consumption. How do we make it more efficient?
So traditionally, we've been focusing, particularly in developing countries, right? In developing supply, looking at supply. The demand was always growing fast. It was never enough. Access was an issue, and we had to develop more power generation. But in some economies, even though there is still need for additional power supply, many governments are starting to realize that demand cannot be just left to manage itself. It has to be controlled, or at least make it more efficient. So we stop wasting. A big example is a new regulation that came in Uzbekistan that presidential decree instructed agencies to focus specifically in reducing natural gas consumption, as well as electricity efficiency in general for households, commercial. This comes because essentially Uzbekistan is now a net importer of gas, when traditionally it was an exporter and had plenty of it. Now they're having issues with their own gas supply, and they're starting to realize that you have to stop wasting energy. And that happens in different levels in other economies.
Wonderful. From my work in Uzbekistan, I remember that may have been one of the last places I saw tons of incandescent light bulb going. Now, if global societal awareness comes across the country, so everyone will start looking where to save, no? Is ADB helping with that?
Totally. We have different promises. We try to touch the different parts of the business. Very recently, we had a policy-based loan approved, and one of the main policy actions was related to increasing residential tax, particularly in these Central Asian countries. Many of these regulated rates heavily subsidized. So people don't have that financial incentive to save because it's so cheap that who cares? But out of the blue, not really out of the blue, but last summer, the electricity tariffs doubled. 100% increase from one day to another makes people realize that, hold on, let's turn off that light or try to use an LED. And the same goes with gas. Gas is a big source of heating for most of the households, and including the district heating networks. And there has been a lot of waste. By touching on the price of the energy supply, as well as looking at policies on how to incentivize efficient use, that go a long way. That's what exactly is happening in Uzbekistan right now.
So what was the tariff and where it is now, average?
So in electricity, it was 450 SUM, which is equivalent to about 3.7 US cents per kilowatt hour. And it was doubled to 900, which
So
is
it's 7 cents. Okay.
yes.
So it's just above maybe the price of rooftop solar. So yeah, that's good.
Yeah, and 1 to 2 gigawatts of solar PV rooftops have been installed in the last 3 to 4 years across the country. For a country with about 16, 17 gigawatts of grid power demand, 1 to 2 gigawatts of solar rooftop, it's a big chunk that came up very quickly.
Yes, and those are mostly households, not multi-story, right? You have a
Yes.
lot of roof access, and this country can get very hot and get a lot of sun.
That's right. In fact, one of the reasons that I've heard people install these rooftops is because not so much about the price, they want to save money, but because the power supply is not that reliable, particularly outside the big cities. So they're finding 3, 4, maybe 6 hours of blackout every day because of the instability of the grid. So they decided to just buy their own power generation for their house.
Now, all we have to do add batteries, then they have 24/7 supply.
If it's big enough. And some of them are installing batteries behind the meter.
Okay. Now, you are earlier mentioning demand. So you also looking at the demand management side of it and how to help them be more efficient in their cooling side.
Actually, some time ago, we started a knowledge product, as we call it here in ADB, essentially a publication. Consultant working in China, senior researcher from ADBI, our think tank, ADB Institute, and myself. And we realized that even though we heard a lot about the importance of efficient cooling and how cooling is going to drive power demand in the coming years, particularly in countries like Indonesia, where a lot of people are going to the middle class and they can afford their first AC. Current projections say that by 2050, about half of the electricity consumption would go for residential cooling, which is a huge number. So we decided to put together a publication, which I have here, and which is available in our website to download for free in PDF, Sustainable Cooling. And it touches about many different angles on reducing cooling demand, making cooling efficient. That's all the impacts that will have different impact on climate, in the electricity grids, on health, as well as ways of doing it technically. For example, district cooling systems, explaining the different aspects of the coolant fluids themselves, policy and financing. So I think it's quite a complete book that touches upon many different angles on this topic. And I think it's quite interesting for policymakers as well as general public.
Are you taking those recommendations and then now you're working closely with Uzbekistan, is the government planning to pick up some of those recommendations and action?
That's right. So very recently, other colleagues published one handbook on energy efficiency, which is a very thick textbook type of publication, very technical. And we gave some copies to the Ministry of Finance in Uzbekistan. And in the last meeting, actually, they took it out and they put it on the table and they said, we read it. We want to do this. So they're taking it very seriously. I think that ADB has positioned themselves as technically savvy partner that is not only providing financing, but also providing the technical means to really do it, at least in the most effective way and using international best practices. So at least in Uzbekistan, they're taking seriously very much the energy efficiency angle and how to reduce demand, but keeping services on.
If you look at the marginal greenhouse abatement curve, energy efficiency is still negative. It's still
the cheapest.
Negative. People are saying, I'll pay you average $40 a ton for the CO2 save. If you do energy efficiency, you get paid back.
That's right. If there was a real working carbon market in a way that you really get easily paid those tons of savings, obviously it would be a no-brainer. If something is cheaper, why not? Problem is to actually have a real functioning market. And that's very tricky. I'm not criticizing what is established now, but it would definitely go a long way. As a matter of fact, in Europe now, the emitters, particularly for power generation, are charged the market price of carbon, of tons of carbon emitted. And that's are trickled down to the bills of consumers. So we're seeing expensive energy now because the price of carbon has been embedded into the overall energy bills. And that makes a huge difference because now people are starting to look at alternatives.
Yeah, but the average person, if they had equivalent of saying, okay, I can choose the retailer that I get supply from. And with that full contestability, theoretically, of course, electrons have no color, but you should be able to send your money who is putting in the maximum number of renewable into the grid.
Some retailers market themselves as only selling renewable energy. But again, some would like to choose, I prefer to buy only green, and that's fine. They are able to do it. They have to pay a little bit more. The issue is if those that are actually only selling green would be able to make it cheaper. And it's not really happening because of how the markets are structured. Spot markets eventually pay only one price to the latest bidder coming in that bid. And that changes every hour, every day and every season. And effectively, it's very difficult to translate those green electrons into lower prices. That's, I think, one of the main barriers to really expand this demand. Having said that, there is even something that is even more troubling, those that can afford their own mini grid at home, have a big house with a big roof, you install your solar rooftop, you have your battery, you have electric car, the heat pump, everything. You eventually become your own mini grid and you're connected to the grid to use that supply for just a few days a year. Those guys have effectively get subsidized to install solar rooftops. All these technologies are subsidized, at least maybe even some tax holidays applied. But then on the other hand, the people that cannot afford anything that live in a multi-apartment building, those guys have to pay full price of whatever they get in the grid supply. And eventually, their marginal cost is higher, even though they are lower income compared to the guys with the big house. So all these things is not a perfect functioning market. People are working on make it efficient.
Yeah, the three things that you mentioned there, these are big policy issues. The first one is very easy. Okay, although the market price fluctuates day to day, you can have a bilateral hedge or contract with a green, like what ADB to get a geothermal, right? We'll pay you so that the green company gets paid a flat fixed price against a hedge against a system marginal price. But the second issue is the most tricky one that, okay, those houses who become self-sufficient were subsidized and they're using the grid as an insurance without paying much for it because if there's a cloudy days, if there's a battery failure, suddenly they will turn up to the grid. Maybe they will pay a little bit of price for that day, but it's an insurance that has not been called on. How do we make those systems fair? Yeah, that's $1 million question. A lot of regulators are asking globally. I'm partially guilty of that also in my house. I think I've been getting negative electricity bills for the last few months. That my house in Melbourne, I put a decent sized battery and I have enough solar power. So I get mostly negative. And then thirdly is, okay, we take all of those things and the willingness to pay and ability to pay are not the same, right? How do we make sure those are willing to pay, take there, and those unable to pay, and then we create a balance at a grid level? Because the grid was not designed to do all those social things. It was saying, okay, you bid it out, system marginal price, lowest guy sets the marginal price, and we move on. But there are a lot of games goes on.
It's not a perfect system. It's a well-functioning one. It worked very well in the 90s. There was a real bid because all the competitors were doing the same thing. Now you cannot put on the same competitive ring a hydropower plant that was built 50 years ago, a solar farm, some wind generation, and then a CCGT. They are different animals. You cannot be playing the same game. I think, at least in my view, the markets should evolve and move away a little bit from the current systems. They work, but then it creates some friction that eventually has to get paid by the regular consumer. Much alternative.
Market been working. This debate has been going on in Australia quite a bit because in that spin, also you have large batteries. When the system price is going negative, the batteries are sucking the energy in and then spit it out at a very high price, competing with the CCG. So it's a very interesting, the market sending the right signal. But again, how do you make it fairer to people who are not in the game at all? So that's the challenge.
And another thing is that when you have some very important or at least significant penetration of variable renewables, all these balancing services, the ancillary services, and they are starting to become larger and larger than the final bill. And sometimes you can see all these publications that say, oh, we got negative prices today at noon in Victoria. But then when you look at the final price, you're seeing that it's 3 cents per kilowatt hour ancillary services. Because all those things that are happening, as you said, those batteries charging when the prices are low and they're selling later at peak. At the end of the day, it was not negative price. You have all this huge inertia in the system, synchronous generation, very little variables. So there was no issue, but now it's becoming very important and starting to become pricey as compared to the overall bills.
Yeah, other complicated factor that coming into is also the electric car with the vehicle to grid. So they also becoming a dispatchable electricity. We have in Australia is a number of companies who are basically buying rights to access to your battery, whether it's your electric car. Today it's definitely batteries. So I have an agreement with a company who said, we will tap into your battery X number of hours in a month, And in lieu of that, we'll give you a fixed monthly fee. And I think initially I got $500 or $600 just to sign up. Plus, they put in some extra as an incentive to move in. So now, from time to time, I say, oh, okay, in the middle of the day, they took all the battery energy out because system price was much higher. So that's helping the system not to go to the peak. I mean, like a value of lost load, $10,000 a megawatt hour level. But at the same time, I'm getting paid because I don't have time to sit down and optimize, but
Right.
I'm also getting paid from that benefit. But the challenge for you, I think, as ADB staff, when you are bringing in Central Asian clients and other clients who are so far from this sort of advanced system, but you want to leapfrog them. Now that's quite daunting because you are jumping through decades of experience in
But
one meeting.
I agree. But then in a certain way makes it easier. Because if you're able to leapfrog and just jump 20 years of development, you're able to get rid of all the heritage that you didn't want in the first place. And you jump into new technologies right away after getting rid of Soviet-built equipment that is 50 years old. And we are seeing that. We're seeing substations that have been built in the 60s. And we are just refurbishing everything and digitizing them and connecting. About electric vehicles, the amount of electric vehicles on the street is mind-blowing. And when I was talking with distribution utility, I was asking them, what are you doing to control or at least to manage this massive load that you're having out of the blue? And they were saying, we're not doing anything yet. Maybe we should look at that because you have thousands of electric cars now in Tashkent that being charged at different times of the day. Electricity grid had the same transformers as 3 years ago. So that's huge additional load. It's essentially overloading some of the transformers at certain times. And that's something that was not yet thought through. And that's something that we are starting to support the country for.
Tashkent city is like any other city in Asia. Traffic jam is there. Average person maybe does 30 or 50 kilometer a day, which is 3 to 5 kilowatt hour a day, not much. So whatever savings you are making out of efficient air conditioning at home might actually offset the use of your car. And part of those will be also picked up by rooftop solar and others. People will mostly charge at home. So I think that early thinking 5 years ago, okay, if the car comes in, the whole grid will crash. We are not seeing that evidence everywhere because average person uses very little electricity.
Cars are able to manage the charge. It's not that if you plug in a 7 kilowatt charger, it's going to be sucking in 7 kilowatts at any given time. It actually fluctuates. But still, you have a street of residential when 5 years ago, their load was pretty much fixed because of the things that you have at home. And suddenly all those guys buy electric cars. Suddenly you're going to have at certain points of the day, double demand, even more than that. And some of those feeders are really small. They were not designed for that capacity. And they're starting to have issues with that. In my house, sometimes it's rare the day that we don't have some supply breaks. A few minutes, suddenly lights go off and come up again.
Interesting, because what we are seeing in Australia, especially South Australia, and I think Australian National Grid also, it's the middle of the sunny day where the off-peak time is. It used to be usually 2 o'clock in the morning now when everybody has got the solar on. Woo, demand is almost gone. The system disappears. So I'm sure Tashkent and others, as some of those behind the meter starts to go through net metering, that might have the same impact. But this is a very exciting time to be working in those developing countries.
That's the beauty of this job, right? You manage to be in the middle of the change, and it's a dramatic change in the system. And it's really exciting to be able to have a hand on it.
Yeah, no, I'm very excited to hear this because I remember first time when I took over Karek responsibility, second time, maybe 2015, and in Mongolia. So Cleo Kawawaki, who's a director general now, she was telling me, do you really want to tell them? I said, no, we have to push. So I posted on my presentation saying Central Asia running on gas, can't produce gas anymore, but not today, maybe 5 years time. You have to go solar and this what's happening in Australia. One senior person, he's, I think, at a deputy minister level in Uzbekistan, last time I checked, he came in and he told me, you stressing me out. I want Jim Liston back. Mr. Hasni, I don't like you. But later on, subsequently, 3-4 years time, I took them to Kareg. And he was saying, I have my nephew who's running a solar business. We are thinking, and he became a real champion. Not that I contributed, but hearing from you today that there is so much rooftop and can having lots and lots of electric car, that's also mind-boggling, no?
They have signed in the last 5 years about 10 gigawatts of solar and wind. Some of them under construction now, some of them already around 1.5 or 2 gigawatts have been commissioned. So by 2030, around 40% of the grid is going to be already a renewable. And by 2035, the target by the government is 54%. So we're talking that in a span of a little bit over a decade, more than half of the Uzbekistan power grid is going to be fed by renewables.
Yeah, these countries, I mean, by design, should be the highest producer of solar power in the world because cheap land and wind also, right? There's
Yes.
such a high altitude countries, 38, 34 degrees. So this is where the wind is.
Yeah, and they're plateaus, so you have a long corridors with big prevalent winds. We are currently working on a large PPP of 1.5 gigawatts of wind farm, 3 sections with 500 megawatt hour batteries.
Amazing. Are these going through an auction process or these are direct?
ADB has been involved, as you remember, setting up the PPP office back in the day, the Ministry of Finance. Then it was a spin-off. Many of those tenders happened. IFC, BRD, and ADB launched some of the tenders. They are currently doing a bilateral negotiation with investors. You have guys from Europe, you have guys from China, you have guys from the Middle East signing bilaterally negotiated PPAs at similar or lower prices than those prices in the tenders. So far, that's the current situation. We are always pushing for competitive biddings because it helps really assess what is the market price at any given time rather than just relying on all data. But that's what the government is comfortable doing now, and we are supporting some of those projects as well.
Are they also considering manufacturing of solar panel? Because I know there was a small manufacturing in Kyrgyzstan, but that was not quite manufacturing, more assembly kind of thing.
We are starting to look at the supply chain. As Asian countries, perhaps because of their heritage, they are comfortable manufacturing things. And even though they have China very close to import everything relatively cheap. For example, the smart meter program, initially they have to import those smart meters and they decided to manufacture them. And midway, they actually were installing the locally manufactured smart meters. With solar, there is a local company that is starting to do that. They import the solar cells and they assemble the panels. The solar cells are imported from China. So they're starting to get into the supply chain. Also, they have huge mineral resources, copper, rare earths, and whatnot. So actually now ADB is supporting a TA to look at the supply chain and manufacturing, clean technology, manufacturing supply chain, looking from the mineral mining all the way to final product and trying to advise Uzbekistan and some regional countries how to maximize this.
Amazing. Because Uzbekistan also has car manufacturing, right?
All the Chevrolets that you saw, well, you still see in Tashkent, they're manufactured there. They had an arrangement with GM since many years ago. But recently, BYD, the largest electrical manufacturer in the world now, signed up an agreement with the country and they're going to set up, or actually they are building already, a manufacturing assembly plant, not a manufacturer, assembly plant of BYD cars. They're going to set it up there and then they're going to use it.
Because the BYD has been very successful in the Philippines when it got launched. So yeah, BYD has done extremely well in partnership with the local companies, although they're not manufacturing, but the numbers are really growing very fast.
If you go to Uzbekistan now, you will see BYDs in every corner. It's incredible.
That's very good news.
They don't have net zero plan, not like China or Europe where they're planning to really get to net zero. I can't remember the figure now, but they want to really drop their emissions. I think partially because of this climate angle that every country has now, maybe a step of the US in recent times. but mostly because of the savings of gas. Their economy has been mostly based in burning gas. They had it and it was cheap, and infrastructure was there when after independence. But since 2023, they became a net importer, and it's getting charged relatively high prices for the gas that comes from Russia and Turkmenistan. So they are focused now on reducing gas consumption as much as they can, which will have huge impact on carbon emissions. And we are also thinking whether we should get into the supply chain of gas to reduce methane emissions, essentially abate those emissions, try to reduce the impact of old piping systems, dilapidated networks that's still in place. And that would be something that we would have a huge impact. But so far, we haven't started looking at that in detail.
Yeah, for that, you have to move upstream. And Turkmenistan, especially, they have a lot of issues of gain, leakage,
Oh,
efficiency.
huge. But Turkmenistan is a small economy in that sense, even though they huge gas producer and huge gas exporter. But it's a different place to work.
This is fantastic that you are looking and being able to work in a country like Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, the whole region that understood nothing but fossil fuel, now
Yeah.
sort of seeing the light and becoming a leader in the region. That's extraordinary.
It's a really extraordinary experience. I agree with you. It has been a gas-fired economy. The cars use gas. The heating used gas. The power generation was gas. And suddenly there is no much gas anymore. What do? Electric cars, 10 gigawatts of renewables, electrification of systems. Now we are looking at spreading or mainstreaming heat pumps for heating and cooling. So it's a massive shift on understanding. And you can see that at government. I went in 2019, I was discussing some issues with the government. All the school guys, they were telling you, that's not for us. That's advanced technology we don't need here. 3 years later, suddenly they're embracing smart meters, SCAD. They're going in the right direction. There was a switch in their thinking, and that's, I think, is very important.
Once the penny drops, things really start moving very fast because all the things that they have been resisting have to let go suddenly. There's no other defense, right?
Yeah, if you want to put walls to the sea, eventually the sea will break those walls and come in. In a way, it happened. There was plenty of pressure to come in these countries and invest in renewables. And there was certain resistance until suddenly they realized that it's good for the economy. We can make money with this generation. We don't have to keep holding all that back. So I think they realized it's good also for the country, not only from the climate angle, but in general. It's good for economic growth, welfare of people, less pollution, all that.
Central Asia, especially Uzbek, Kazakh, and Turkmenistan, because the countries are so big and dispersed population. So solar, putting into the center solar and running it through the grid still will have a huge expense to bring it to the door of everyone. So I thought there is a huge opportunity. Government had interest when I was working in those countries in some sort of micro distributed off-grid systems. Has there been any progress on those? Because consumption is very little. Of course, the heating is a big issue, but still, so those population to run a dingy grid, very long distances are very expensive.
Completely agree with you. Now the technologies are cheap enough to compete. 10 years ago, when we started looking at mini grids in many places, and whether you have to choose whether rural electrification or mini grid at the time, it was a difficult choice. But now it's a no-brainer. Battery plus solar is cheaper than extending a medium voltage and low voltage grid to those places. So now the government made a recent request to us to look into distributed generation using solar, not yet batteries, because they're fully electrified. I think they want to pump up a little bit and produce some cheap electricity during some times of the day. But eventually, when the price of batteries come down, I think we'll be able to set up not a mini grid, but at least some generation that it will help balance a little bit at the last mile of the electricity grids. The low voltage generation, I think, is going to happen soon. We are looking at that now.
Yeah, even just those batteries, I saw prices 1 megawatt, 3 megawatt hour in a container, $400,000. You can just plonk it in between your distribution grid just to take over the 2-3 hours interruption suddenly happens. The balancing and also for reliability, right?
Yes, exactly.
And then it can also suck in local Access solar, provide a electric vehicle, bus charging in the middle of nowhere for free. It's fascinating stuff.
And it's a source of local jobs. We are strong on the gender angle in every project. And we found there is a lot of demand for these small solar systems to train women in villages, in faraway remote neighborhoods, to be the ones taking care of those systems because they are next to their house. So that's something that we are working on as well in terms of how to support the local community by installing these systems that is not only going to generate cheap electricity, but also provide sources of income for the people living there, which eventually will make it embrace more that technology and help the government actually achieve better development objectives and economic objectives.
Yeah, this is the little company that I set up. We are developing a project concept. Is halfway there. Is basically put a lot of solar at schools and then give each child a little half a kilowatt hour box.
But
You have a USB-C, USB, and it has a built-in inverter and others, so you don't have to do anything. So you give the kids to come to the school as an incentive rather than giving cash. You come to the school, plonk it in. So solar charging plus charging your battery. When you go home, you take that home, connect your whole
yeah,
house, free electricity because you went to the school. So it
Yeah.
can be tied as a very nice incentive. And you also do rural electrification in a way, because if people bought those batteries, it may not work. But because they are bringing every day to the school, if it doesn't matter, you take the one that is working. So when I was thinking of doing that many years ago, as you said, the technology was not ready. But now the technology is ready and you look at it, say, wow, this can change lives, seriously.
in remote areas, that the places that we're working, the all solar home system structure, it was a good idea. It was very expensive. But now the fact that you can actually move the electricity battery and generation is not so dependent on where it is. So as you say, you can centralize it in a school rather than having solar rooftops in every little house.
Yep.
It makes a difference. Also, as you said, it's easier to manage the maintenance of the systems. If you have a centralized rooftop and some spare batteries, you ensure that supply will continue. If you have it at the various houses, people don't know what to do with it. The moment it stops working, they just take out the panels and they use it for fences or things like that. I've seen some places.
Yeah, we are bringing the community, especially women, and give them appliances. And suddenly you create an ecosystem. Someone has a drill, uses the drill, and you don't need drill every day. So someone else can take the drill and run it. So it's fascinating when you start looking what a kilowatt hour can do to a rural poor household. 1 kilowatt hour is a lot of electricity, although when you switch off your air conditioner, it goes in
It
10
goes to-
minutes. Yeah.
For these communities, particularly, they don't have heating or cooling. They just maybe use a couple of fans, a small LCD TV or whatever it is. Their consumption is minimal. Probably in the month, they don't reach even 50 kilowatt hours. It's almost nothing.
Yeah. Average person in Australia consumes 15 kilowatt hour. So unless you have a large heated swimming pool, it's very hard to consume those electricity. 15 kilowatt hour is a lot.
And appliances are becoming more efficient. Fridges, air cons, everything is actually starting to suck in less electricity, which is good, obviously.
Yeah. I mean, you are doing a lot of exciting stuff. So what else you do other than working all the time?
I try to maximize time with the kids. The good thing of Uzbekistan is that you can do a lot of things outside of the city. You can go hiking. In the winter, you can go skiing. There are horses, beautiful places to visit. So it's a really nice place to be. And my family and I are really enjoying it. So I try to maximize time with the family when I'm not working. And sometimes I spend time because this thing over here, it was done on my spare time. That was not part of my business. There was no project related to it. Just thought it was a good idea to do. And I took time off to do the editing, to talk with people, to write 2 chapters. Let's say that I cannot do nothing. So I just keep myself entertained with little projects like this or training stuff and things like that.
I'm technically also retired. I cannot just sit down and do nothing.
Your works will follow you.
Is there anything else you want to share?
I invite your listeners to visit Central Asia. It's a really fascinating part of the world, and it's starting to open. Uzbekistan was relatively closed until 2017. Now it's really pulling in tourism. It's a beautiful part of the world, together with Tajikistan, with Kyrgyz Republic. So I encourage people to visit the area because it's really great, really beautiful, and they will definitely enjoy it. Many of your listeners probably, if they're in Australia, they have visited Bali, Indonesia, Southeast Asia. Just go a little bit farther to Central Asia and they will discover a beautiful part of the world.
Amazing part of the world.
Yes, and lovely food, and lovely people.
Thank you so much for your time, Alfredo.
Thanks, Sohail. Have a great day.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Energypreneurs. To continue listening to this conversation, please visit us at Energypreneurs. Thank you. See you next time.